Snow was closing in on mother and her newborn child. Then a quiet cowboy offered shelter. The sun cut hard through blown white dust, and the high country beyond the Canadian River shone with a dry blue light, and Maris O'Keefe moved sideways through it, bracing the newborn against her chest. The bundle breathed a dim heat through wool and flannel, and her boots slid on the crust. But she did not stop behind her. The wind ate prints as fast as she made them, and in her head, a voice rang like ice split with an iron bar. One careless word, and you won't be found so, said Vance Breaker when he shoved a sack under the washhouse barrel at the horse relay and smiled the thin smile of a nail scoring wood. And that was when Maris knew to leave while day still burned bright, and while the child breathed even she did not pray. She only moved and kept her voice small and steady, so the little one would know she was near sleep. Now little light, the snow will wander long. We will cross the draw and find a roof. And each breath answered with a warmth inside the bundle. When the wind fell for a blink, the whole country went quiet. So quiet she heard the sugar squeak of the crust and the dry hiss of grass under drift that gave her measure. And then the slope rose sharp, and her toe caught a hidden root. Her hand slapped ice, her knee punched through. She folded around the child and felt a tremor start at her shoulders and run clean to her heels. "Do not cry, little one," she said, not knowing if he heard her. The sun stung her eyes, and yet the world blurred as if water swam there. And just then a shadow unstitched itself from the tree line, a figure in a dark duster with a pale glint of metal at the belt, hat brim pulled low. He did not rush. He knelt, and with a gloved hand covered the tiny face from the wind, checked the breathing. First, then lifted the bundle and lifted Maris in the same sure motion and turned back through the trees. He walked so even that the wind itself seemed to smooth out around them. He said nothing, only laid his own wool scarf over the flannel to dam the cold. The horse stood in a pocket of lee, a calm chestnut with wet breath and a square pack lashed tight. The leather creaked as they moved a few minutes, and the osier grove opened around a cabin of peeled logs, roof low smoke thin and blue like a fiddle string. The door groaned open and warm air met them, clean and pine sweet and alive with the ticking iron stove inside. Order had a shape, and it made Maris still her step at the threshold. Jars on a shelf held flour beans, coffee in clean rows. A plank table caught a bright stripe of daylight from the single window tools hung by size along a peg rail. A rip saw a gouge, a worn set of reins. Nothing wasted. A small crate stuffed with straw turned to a cradle in a heartbeat, when the man threw a rolled coat into it and pulled soft sheepskins over the boards. The little one sighed once and settled. The blood came back to Maris' hands when he sank them in a bowl of warm water and set a coarse towel across her fingers. He moved with the hush of learned craft, always the same angle of wrist, always the same patience in the way a sliver of kindling nested under another. She wanted to speak thanks, but the cold pinched her throat, so she only nodded. He answered with a nod, no larger than a breath, and stepped to the door to shake snow from his coat. Only then did Maris notice the thing that did not fit among bridles and chisels in a shadowed corner near the wall. Stood a small parlor organ, the bellows stitched with a leather strap, the lid nicked with the letters "Seer" cut by a careful blade that explained why the man had paused on the open snow when she sang thin as thread for the baby. Something in those notes had caught a path in him from years back. He brewed willowbark tea in a blackened kettle and tipped cracked corn into a pot. The taste was plain and warm, and after 2 spoonfuls the cold stopped biting her lips. The child slept with a mouth corner, just open breath so soft. She had to lean close to see it. Maris listened to the stove count time with tiny cracks and to the wind working far outside. As if the cabin were a lonesome ship on a white sea, the cowboy set an axe by the door and with an old habit checked the bar on the latch like a rider checks a cinch before a long ride. He still had not offered a name, and somehow that did not thin trust, because there was no hard wall in his quiet. Only the sense that words do little against weather. Day by day, the light walked into the room at the same angle, and Maris learned its rhythm each morning. She hung the swaddles above the stove and rubbed dry leaves he brought from Lee Slopes to brew against the baby cough, and strung her wool scarf on a cord which had become a small flag of escape. By late day the man came from timber with a fork of wood in each hand, swept snow from the sill with his forearm so he would not track slush inside, and only then met her eyes, and the eyes of the child. Her back stopped burning. Her movements remembered their balance. She stood at the pot and stirred, and the mush grew thick and kept the salt and the few dried berries from a cloth bag. One noon, she risked the word that had rolled under her tongue since the first hour. "Thank you." And after that, very slow and plain, "My name is Maris." He did not shy from her voice, did not act as if he had not heard. He set a bowl of meal on the table, and without looking away, answered in the same plain way, "Silas Reed." So that was the first time she heard his name, and the name did not float off. It landed on the floorboards and stayed like a knot tied for keeping Silas. Spoke little, but his hands told full stories when he sliced winter meat into neat thin fans and set them to dry above the stove. When he lifted the rifle, checked the round, wiped the oil, and stood it again by the window frame without any show. There was a calm in those motions that loosened the chest, and the baby learned the house too. He cried now for hunger, not fear, and fell quiet at the small tune his mother coaxed from her throat sometimes, when Maris touched the organ with one curious finger. The bellows seemed to give a faintness, as if memory itself leaned forward to breathe, but the instrument held its peace like the man who owned it. One late afternoon, a new thing appeared by the cradle, a little maple horse the size of a palm carved smooth and left without eyes, only two fine cuts in their place, which made it look more alive. And Maris knew then that a child had once lived here, that the silence of this house had not been born of emptiness, but of a remembrance that does not demand language. She did not ask who Silas had lost, or why he chose to live alone. She knew how answers can flay a person from the inside. Instead, she learned to read the bright day. By the way the door opened, and a clean rectangle of snowlight fell across the boards, when Silas crossed the threshold on the third day, when the sun finally split the grey and made the room brighter than before. Maris stepped to the stoop to shake a blanket. The air was glass clear, the branches did not talk. A sly squeak reached her, like a breath under ice. She dropped her gaze to the snow, and saw not her own tracks, nor the prints of Silas. These were the 3 paths of horses drawn from the draw to the narrow run between 2 pines. Over the crust lay more signs, the faint drag of something pulled, and a round bite from an iron shoe with a chipped edge. Maris knew that Chip Vansbreaker wore such shoes because he liked his mark to sign the snow. She held the blanket in 2 fingers and did not move. The sun was bright enough to carve features like with a knife, and in that white honesty, she heard a chair rasp in the cabin. Silas came to the doorway without a question, bent over the edge of the stoop, and studied the 3 paths for a long breath and time inside the room, and time outside seemed to stop measuring in the same units. He straightened and did the things people do who have survived by craft. He took a heavy canvas from a peg and stuffed it into the crack under the door. He drove an extra wedge under the bar. He reached into a chest and drew a flat coil of cord, a simple belt knife, a steel and flint, and another odd piece that looked like a key, but proved a metal hook for sled lashings. His face did not go hard. It went simpler and steadier, and that steadiness let Maris fill her lungs. She did not say she knew that Notched Shoe and Silas did not ask. He opened the shutter a thumb width, so the daylight could fall in a narrow lane across the plank floor and paint any shadow that tried the wall. He drew the cradle closer to the warm iron, so heat would not fail. Not a word lifted above their heads. The quiet now held bright day, the pine pitch smell and the count of a sleeping child, and when Maris laid her palm on the little carved horse she felt the gloss and knew that from now on every sound in this house would have its own true place, and that something was coming slow and sure, like a storm not yet gathered but already combing the tops of the trees. The flames moved like breath inside the small stone mouth. Maris sat close enough to feel heat work back into her bones while her hands still trembled, because warmth cannot chase a memory out of blood. She told him in a level voice what she had seen on the flats by the river, A circle of men and a dust-colored boy, maybe 16, asking where his share went, and Vance Breaker smiling that little split smile he owns, and saying a question costs the price of an answer. Then two of them took the boy behind the canvas store tent, and the snow there went dark, and the boots came back without hurry, and someone laughed, and the laugh sounded like a shovel biting frozen ground. Maris said Vance told her if she put one word in the wrong ear, he would take the dawn away from her child forever. He had promised spring, and a church and a cradle. He had carved a notch at each corner to look like leaves. Then he gambled those promises at a firelit table and won nothing but a colder heart. And when she finished speaking, she folded a palm over Noah's soft crown and looked not at the man by the door, but into the old coals, because that was easier for the truth. Silas Reed sat in the narrow shadow between door and wall, his shoulders filling the space, a whetstone whispering along steel. He did not lift his head. The whetstone went back into a pocket. The blade slid into leather. He crossed to the stove and fed it a square of folded paper, and the fire took it in one bright tongue, and before the paper curled, Maris saw a woodcut face and a name that made a far county ring in her ears. $1,000 for the capture of the quiet Reed, wanted for 5 accounts and questions unanswered. She felt the old reflex of fear climb her throat, and then felt it fail, because his silence had never once felt like a threat, and because the first thing he had done in that white world was warm. Her child not interrogate her. She should have been afraid of a man whose picture rode stagehouse walls, but her heart did not know how to be afraid of hands that had tucked quilts close around Noah and set a tin mug by her palms and stood listening when she sang, almost as if the song had been written for him. She thought the words in the small private place where mothers keep the oaths they make to themselves. I should be afraid of you, and I am not later. When the wind lay down, she woke from a knife-sharp dream with a cry. Noah startled beside her, the room a blur. The door opened without noise. Silas was there. The fire cut his face into planes. She reached for words and found none. He reached into the coat he always wore and placed a small weight beneath the edge of her quilt. The smell of oil and iron rose. She did not need to ask what it was. He did not need to say why, and when their eyes held, there was no bargain inside them. Only a simple agreement about what would be done if the snow carried the wrong footsteps to this door. Days became a kind of measured breathing, the kettle singing, then cooling the axe, rising, then falling, the door opening, then closing in a rhythm that did not ask anything from them except that they keep time. Maris's strength stitched itself back together, one small loop at a time. She wiped the window until the outside came in clear. She pulled the cot closer to the hearth. She hummed the tunes her mother called thread songs, because they tie a room to itself. She found flour in an old tin and made flat bread on a cleaned stove lid. She turned a crate into a cradle liner with an old shearling and laughed once silently into the collar of Silas's coat. When Noah discovered his own hands, as if they were birds, he could catch. There were things in the room that did not belong to the hard life he lived there. A pump organ along the far wall, its name plaque worn smooth by thumbs, and the letters cedar pressed small and patient into the wood. A child's horse whittled from juniper with a notch where an ear had split and been glued true again. A spool of blue thread with hardly any blue left on it. Maris asked him one evening if the organ ever spoke anymore. She asked it the way a person asks the sky if it remembers rain. Silas looked at his hands for the longest time, the palms mapped with old heat, the fingers grown thick where a trigger and a hammer teach bone their lessons. He said he had played for strangers once for pay, and once for someone who never returned. Once for no one because the room needed sound, and he said it so plain it almost did not sound like speaking. Then he went quiet again, which felt like the right kind of answer, when a thing hurts too much to name. The night he checked snares, she sat by the hearth with needle and scrap and stitched names onto a narrow strip of linen, because rooms and people come faster into being when named. She sewed Maris and Noah, and because the letters would not leave her needle alone, she made a third word. Small and true Reed, and when he returned with snow on his shoulders and saw the soft blue letters over the mantel, He stopped halfway through a step. Not grief, not apology in his face. Just a presence arriving like a rider who has been far too long on the road and suddenly recognizes his own gait. The morning after, that had a particular stillness that meant snow would come again. The kind that does not shout as it falls, but goes patiently about its work. Silas left with the first color in the east, and the door whispered closed, and time made itself long after he stepped into it. Maris fed the stove, and fed the child, and tidied the small world they lived in, and watched the trees hold their breath when he came back. The light behind him had turned the color of tin. He set a glove on the table and said only that a big horse with a broken right shoe had crossed the cold creek less than a day ago, and the track pointed itself through their timber, like a finger. Maris felt the old ice run through her, then stop and turn to something steadier. She asked if it was Vance, and he said he did not spend his life on guesses. He spent it on preparations, and he began to make them. He moved the bench flat to the door and wedged it true with an iron wedge he had forged years back. He brought shutters down and slatted them from the inside with a carpenter's eye for where the grain would split. He lifted a loose board beneath the bed and came up with a short, heavy shotgun wrapped in a wool sleeve. Then he opened a narrow drawer in the table and set out cartridges in 2 neat rows like prayer beads. And last, he unbuttoned the side of his coat and laid a revolver down as careful as a man sets a name on a headstone. "There is a small one too," he said after a while, and he went to a chest and returned with a pistol that looked like a story someone kept telling until it smoothed out of anger into use the metal clean. "The wood dark from 1,000 winter palms. He said you will learn, and she said I have never. And he said you will. And he did not lift his voice. He just took her into the yard where the snow had crusted thin and bright and put her feet right and her elbows right, and her intention right. He told her to breathe like a person who means to stay. He told her to let the sight find its rest, instead of dragging it where it did not want to go. The first shot cracked and echoed up a drawer, and Noah wailed in the door, and the sound hurt her deeper than the recoil ever could. The second shot came easier. The third went where she had told it to go, and by the 6th, she had a line in her shoulders that looked like a decision. And when they went inside again, the dusk had come down without drama and made everything close and understandable. Silas set the weapons on the table and broke them open and wiped them as if asking them to do one honest job more. Maris rocked Noah and sang low and steady and matched his careful motions with her own care. She brewed bark tea against the ache in her arms and hung the linen ribbon with their 3 names, where the warm air could lift it just enough to look alive. And she watched his hands, the way one watches a craftsman who no longer loves his craft, but refuses to do it poorly, out of respect for what it once meant, when the baby slept and the room breathed easy. She stepped onto the porch with his old coat around her, and the world had that blue time when the day is still present, but knows it must let go. She looked toward the timber and then at nothing at all. Sang the lullaby her mother had used when wind rattled winter windows back in the small place she had thought she would die in. Someday the melody walked out between the pines and laid itself along the creek stones and found the old trail where her fear used to travel and stood there instead of running. The door eased open behind her, and she did not turn, because she already knew his weight in the boards and his rifle carried low and safe, and the way silence gathers around a man who listens for a living. He stood beside her and did not scan the dark, like a man spoiling for news. He let the song finish its work when the last thin note let go of the air. The forest made a sound like a whisper of leather. Somewhere far up the ridge, a crow turned and went to black branches, and then the breeze arrived from the north, smelling faintly of tobacco, from a kind Vance always chewed, more than smoked. Maris felt her throat harden, and then soften because hardness would not help them, and softness would not break them, either. She said quietly that she would not run again, and he said just as quietly that he had not brought them here to run. He tipped the rifle once toward the tree line, the gesture small and complete like a benediction, and they went back inside to a fire that had kept faith and a ribbon with 3 names that would not burn, and a table where iron slept like a promise. and the night sat down with them and waited in the straight-backed way. A night waits when it knows men are already in the snow and coming. Morning did not arrive so much as reveal itself one careful inch. At a time, frost, lifting off the spruce, tips a pale gold crawling across the creek ice, and the air clear enough to hear a raven turn its head and choose a different branch. Silas moved through the room without noise, the way men learn to move when sound has cost them things. He checked the shutters with a thumb pressed to each hinge. He slid the bench tight to the door. He laid 2 cartridges by the jamb. Not because 2 would be enough, but because 2 within a hand's width can be the difference between fear and decision. Maris fed the stove and Noah both, and tied the blue ribbon with their stitched names higher, where flame could not jump to it. And then she saw Silas's gaze leave the room and go a long way out into the trees, and she knew without asking that the world beyond had stepped closer. He said only riders, and she felt her ribs go small, then widen again to make room for breath. They came from the stand of dark fir, as if the forest had grown them 3 across the snow in the clean sun, Vance Breaker fronting them in a city coat that did not belong to this country, his horse high-stepping and proud because it had never had to work for a living, the other 2 with caps pulled low, and the kind of posture that confuses cruelty with spine. They stopped 10 paces shy of the porch, which is the distance a story chooses when it aims to turn into a legend. Vance called up with a voice used to being obeyed and asked, not for truth, not for peace, not for mercy, but for ownership. He said, "Bring me the woman and the child I am owed," and he smiled the way a man smiles at a mirror he believes will not break. Silas did not answer. He lifted the latch and stepped into the fine, bright cold, and the sun put a hard shine on the nicked bluing of his revolver, and the men on the horses shifted without meaning to Vance. Said a quiet thing about prices and debts, and tried to make those words sound like law and Silas. Said another quiet thing about thresholds, and it sounded older than law because it was, and everything that followed happened with the kind of speed that later lives inside a person. As a series of still pictures, the first shot cracked snow into silver dust. A rifle jumped from a rider's hands and went spinning end over end. The second man reached downward too fast, and the old shotgun from beneath the bed thundered once from the back window, because Maris had learned not only the feel of a pistol in her palm, but the wisdom of distance and angles. The blast took bark courage from a grown man. He turned his horse and fled with that small hunch that shows when a body remembers it is mortal. Vance fired twice fast and ugly, and one round chewed a porch post, and one found Silas's upper arm, and the world tilted, then reset, and Silas took one knee and did not let himself measure pain, because men who measure pain in the middle of a job tend to die doing math. He worked the cylinder with a thumb and sent a round into the butt of the tree where Vance crouched, and the splinters taught Vance that wood is not sanctuary. Maris opened the door just enough to wedge the bench tighter, and in the same motion, set Noah behind the stove shield. Then took the little pistol and put herself where the hinge would hide her. If the door came in, she did not tremble now. Or if she did, it was a tremble that knew its place and did not argue with purpose. Vance tried to turn the fight into talk again because words had bought him power before, but silence stood its ground, the kind that has a spine and breath inside it. And then the fight changed shape entirely, because smoke began to roil from a rag bundle. He rolled beneath the eave, and fire is always every coward's ally on a bright day, and the roof spit a line of sparks across the snow. Silas slid along the wall and dumped a bucket he had set for this very treachery, and steam rose and the cedar shingles drank and hissed. He angled off the porch into shadows where low scrub made a seam with the drift, and went around the flank of the tree that held Vance, and came up, not with a shout, but with a breath and the muzzle a finger's width from the thought Vance was about to have. The gun bucked once and the bark beside Vance's ear flew, and the message entered his body in a language men always understand. Vance reached for bravado and found only gloves and cold. He went to mount. He spurred right hard. The horse lurched, and in that same beat a snare line Silas had knotted at dawn caught the foreleg not to cripple, only to pause. And that is all Silas ever a pause. The rope tightened, The horse checked itself clean and Vance toppled into snow, and the world made a hollow sound around him. Maris was there at the door with the pistol low but certain, and Noah quiet under a wool fold, and she said nothing because nothing needed saying. She watched Silas walk Vance in with 2 fingers at the back of the man's collar like a father moving a boy who had forgotten himself, and they set him on the floorboards where sunlight fell and tied his wrists with the same patience used to lash a sled, and the fight was over. Not with cheering and not with curses, just with the old relief of risk stepping outside for a while and letting breath do what breath used to do before guns were invited. The wound in Silas's arm bled the way old scars do, slow then stubborn. So Maris boiled the kettle and mashed willow and set clean cloth and spoke to him in a voice made of work rather than worry. She threaded a needle and drew edges closer and tied each knot like a sentence. She meant the stitches held, the fever did not come, and night crossed the roof while no one talked, because some silences are earned and some are needed by noon. The next day, the sky had that washed blue. That means a road will hold a traveler, and the rope on Vance's wrists had become the beginning of truth. Not vengeance. Maris strapped Noah against her in the shawl and wore Silas's coat, because it held the world like a wall around a fire. They put Vance on his own proud horse and walked him down country toward the territorial town that prides itself on having a judge who listens more than he speaks. The ride took the better part of a day. The creek gave them a bridge of ice. One last time, the cottonwoods stood like old choir members in winter coats, and when they came in along Maine, the snow was swept to either side, and faces rose in windows, because a quiet man who has been rumored into a monster draws a different kind of attention than any parade. The marshal met them by the hitch rail. He had eyes that had seen men do worse and still believed most could do better if handed a clean tool and a straight job. He took Vance with a gentle firmness that made the room steady by the time the courthouse filled. The light had gone thin and gold, and Maris stood in it and pulled a room full of strangers across an invisible line, simply by telling what had been done and by whom, and with what words and which boots and where the bodies lay beneath twisted pine roots and snow. She did not shake, and when her mouth went dry, someone passed her a cup, and she drank and kept telling. Because stopping before the end is its own kind of lie, the judge listened. The way good earth listens to rain. He sentenced Vance Breaker not out of heat, but out of the simple arithmetic of harm and law and loss, and when it was finished, there came that low human sound people make when a tide turns and they recognize the sound of their own shore after years of fog. Then the room turned its attention to the man whose picture had once ridden wagons and saloons, and the quiet he carried came and stood beside him like a brother. Silas Reed did not place blame or dress the past in softer cloth. He laid out the towns and the years and the names that could still be found, and the names that could not. He said he had carried iron too long, and for the wrong reasons, and that if it pleased the court, he would carry it now for a reason. Other than himself, the judge set a hand flat on the desk, and said the territory did not need one more prisoner, who already knew the shape of bars. It needed a tracker, who knew how shadows move, and how to hold a line without making noise, and the marshal nodded once as if agreeing with a thought he had been keeping in his pocket for months. And so the work changed. Not the hands, the work spring did what it always does. It broke winter along its old fault lines. Water found every low place, and made it sweet again, and the hills remembered their green by the time the pass opened. The cabin had a new roof, and the ribbon with 3 names hung above the hearth, a shade higher because new hands had stood on a chair to push its pin into wood. A schoolroom opened in the back of the church where the bell rope wore smooth from Sunday palms, and Maris kept a circle of children in tune and in meals, and showed them how a breath can carry a room to a softer place. The pump organ that had once been a ghost of itself learned to speak again. Her hands on the pedals, his on the keys on evenings when riding aloud, and the sound that came out was not pretty, at first only honest, then slowly it grew a skin of beauty over the bone of truth. Noah learned to walk with one fist in Silas's thumb, and later to run with a shout that turned heads up and down the lane. And on the day he said the word "pa" for the first time, he said it not like a question, but like a fact that had been waiting patiently for his mouth to grow big enough to hold it. Word went around that the mining trail had become safer, and that a man with a wide hat and a quiet way of standing sometimes appeared where Trouble thought it had chosen a private place, and Trouble would look into a pair of eyes that did not brag and did not bend, and then Trouble would remember a chore it had left undone somewhere else. Nobody called this redemption because redemption as a word is too clean for the work required. They called it living right long enough for the old wrong to have fewer places to sleep. One blue evening, when dust off the street windowsills looked almost like snow again, Maris asked Silas if he felt fixed, and he did not answer because fixed is not a thing, men are. He set his hand over hers, and the quiet they shared said what needed saying, that a life does not turn by one heroic yank. It turns by small honest pulls day after day without applause and without a crowd to write it down. And if you are still breathing when the turn is complete, you stand in a place that looks ordinary from the road, and you know it is holy. If this tale put a steady heat in your chest, if you heard the creak thaw and the organ find its voice, if you felt how a hard country can teach a person to choose gentleness without going soft, then you belong with us on wild frontier tales where gunsmoke fades but memory does not, where every ride bends toward a home earned by courage, patience, and love. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next long ride into a sky and land where gunsmoke fades, but memories never do. Every story rides straight into your heart, big enough to carry your own quiet hope.